Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a pretty heavy topic, Agent Orange.
Yeah, it's it's a really complex issue with a long reach.
Yeah, and we've got a great article from History.com to guide us through it. It was updated in 2019, so it's got some good up-to-date information. So, Agent Orange.
Mm.
Most people probably just think, oh, it's, just another weapon used in the Vietnam War.
Right.
But the story goes way deeper than that. It's affected generations of people, both in America and in Vietnam.
You know, one thing that always gets me is the sheer scale of it. Imagine an area the size of Massachusetts, completely defoliated.
Wow.
That's the level of impact we're talking about here.
That is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So the article mentions something called Operation Ranch Hand. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so Operation Ranch Hand, this was a massive defoliation campaign that the U.S. military launched from 1961 to 1971. They sprayed something like over 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It's incredible.
20 million gallons. What was the thinking behind that? What were they trying to achieve?
Basically, they wanted to strip away all that jungle cover and destroy enemy food crops. It was all about disrupting the Viet Cong. Those were the communist guerrilla forces in South Vietnam. They wanted to make it impossible for them to operate.
So they were basically trying to weaponize the environment itself.
Exactly. And the article even talks about this kind of dark humor that was going around among some of the military personnel at the time. They were saying things like, only you can prevent a forest.
Oh.
Like a twisted take on that Smokey Bear campaign.
Right.
But this wasn't about preserving nature, obviously. This was about manipulating it for military advantage.
So in this whole scenario, Agent Orange was the main weapon.
Well, it was the most widely used one, yeah. And it's interesting, the name itself actually comes from the color of the barrels they stored it in.
Really?
Yeah, orange barrels. They had other color-coded herbicides, too. But Agent Orange, it was particularly potent and particularly dangerous because of a contaminant called dioxin.
Dioxin. Yeah. So Agent Orange wasn't just a powerful weed killer then.
Right.
There's this other, more sinister element lurking in those barrels.
Right. And the thing about dioxin is, it wasn't intentionally added to the herbicide. It was a byproduct of the manufacturing process. And what makes it so insidious is that it's incredibly persistent. It doesn't break down easily in the environment. It can linger for decades.
Decades?
Yeah, think about it. You spray a field with a typical herbicide, it breaks down relatively quickly. But dioxin, it sticks around in the soil, the water. It gets absorbed by plants and animals.
So that's where the real danger comes in, long-term exposure.
Exactly. And it's not a simple case of poisoning either. The way dioxin affects the body is very complex. It disrupts cell function, it can mimic hormones, and interfere with all sorts of critical biological processes.
It's more like it's disrupting the body's balance over time.
Precisely. And the consequences of that disruption can be pretty devastating. We're talking about increased risks of cancer, skin diseases, birth defects, a whole range of other health problems.
That's terrifying. And what's scary is the article points out that most human exposure to dioxin, it doesn't come from direct contact with the chemical.
Right.
It comes from
the food we eat, especially animal products.
So like meat and dairy.
Yeah, if animals graze on contaminated land or drink contaminated water, the dioxin builds up in their tissues. And when we consume those animal products, we're basically ingesting that accumulated dioxin.
Wow, so even decades later, this stuff is working its way up the food chain, affecting people who are nowhere near the actual spraying.
That's the tragedy of Agent Orange. It's not a threat that ended with the Vietnam War. It's an ongoing legacy of harm. And it's important to remember, this didn't just impact American veterans. It also had a devastating impact on the Vietnamese people themselves.
And we'll definitely get into that. But first, let's talk a little bit about the effects on veterans.
In the years after the war, this really disturbing pattern started to emerge.
Yeah, a lot of veterans started experiencing all these, strange health problems.
Exactly. And many of them were eventually linked back to Agent Orange exposure.
And I was reading in the History.com article about this guy, Dr. James Clary. He was like an Air Force researcher who was involved in Operation Ranch Hand. And he actually admitted that they knew about the potential dangers of dioxin.
Yeah, it's a tough one because at the time, there wasn't a lot of concern about it. They figured it would only affect the enemy.
It's kind of chilling to think about that now.
It really is. It really underscores the dehumanizing nature of war.
Absolutely. And the consequences of that thinking
Yeah.
have been so devastating for both veterans and the Vietnamese people.
In 1979, millions of veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange, filed this massive class action lawsuit.
That must have been a huge deal.
Oh, it was. It was a landmark case. And in 1984, it resulted in a settlement with 7 chemical companies agreeing to pay $180 million.
Wow.
But even with the settlement, the controversy didn't end there.
Yeah, the article talked about how there were all these challenges that came up.
Exactly. You had individual veterans filing their own lawsuits, and then there was this whole issue with the Blue Water Navy veterans.
Oh, right, the ones who served on ships off the coast of Vietnam.
Exactly. For years, they really struggled to get the same Agent Orange-related benefits as those who served on land.
And that was because they weren't directly involved in the spraying or handling the Agent Orange.
Right. But they could have still been exposed through contaminated water or, in other ways. It took decades for them to get the recognition and benefits they deserved.
It's wild to think about all this happening in the U.S., while in Vietnam the situation was even worse.
So much worse. The Vietnamese government estimates that hundreds of thousands of people were killed or maimed because of Agent Orange, and millions more are still dealing with serious health problems today.
That's just heartbreaking.
And what's even more heartbreaking is the effects of Agent Orange are multi-generational. Children and grandchildren of those exposed are experiencing birth defects and other health complications.
It's a humanitarian crisis that continues to this day. And then I was reading about how there was a class action lawsuit filed by Vietnamese citizens in 2004, and it was dismissed by a U.S. court.
Yeah, that was a really tough one.
It really raises the questions of accountability and responsibility. Who is ultimately responsible for the long-term consequences of Agent Orange?
A tough question.
Is it the chemical companies? The U.S. government? Or is it some kind of shared responsibility?
Yeah, that's not an easy answer.
Not at all. And, I thought it was interesting that Fred A. Wilcox, who wrote that book, Scorched Earth, Legacies of Chemical Warfare in Vietnam, he suggested that the U.S. government was kind of reluctant to fully compensate Vietnamese victims because they were afraid of admitting to war crimes.
I can see that.
And, he said they were worried about opening the floodgates to all these expensive lawsuits.
It's a cynical view, but it does shed some light on the complexities surrounding Agent Orange and its lasting impact.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. And it's clear that the legacy of Agent Orange is one of just profound suffering. But as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways here? What should our listener really understand about all of this?
I think it's crucial to remember that this wasn't some small-scale operation. We're talking about over 20 million gallons of herbicides sprayed over vast areas. It was the deliberate and widespread use of chemical warfare with consequences that are still felt today.
Yeah, and the article really drove home the insidious nature of dioxin. This isn't like your typical herbicide that breaks down quickly. This stuff lingers for decades, working its way up the food chain, affecting not just those directly exposed, but generations that followed.
Right, and that brings us to the lasting impact on both American veterans and the Vietnamese people. We're talking about chronic health problems, birth defects, and, an ongoing struggle for recognition and compensation.
It's a tragic legacy that's still unfolding. Well, this deep dive has definitely been a heavy one, but it's so important to learn from history, even the painful parts. So I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Agent Orange wasn't an isolated incident. It raises these serious questions about the ethics of chemical warfare and the long-term environmental consequences of our actions.
It really makes you think.
Yeah.
About the decisions we make today and how they can have these far-reaching consequences that impact not just us, but future generations as well.
Well said. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex history of Agent Orange. We hope you learned something new today and that you're leaving with a deeper understanding of this really important issue. Until next time.